Once upon a time, in the early days of the American West, a unique group of individuals had emerged, shattering stereotypes and defying expectations. You want to know what they're called, who these were? They were none other than the Black Cowboys. When we hear the word cowboy, most people picture a rugged white man in a wide-brimmed hat riding into the sunset. Hollywood painted that image into our minds for reasonable decades. But what if we told you that history, in its undecorated realist, tells a very different story? The truth is, cowboys were skilled horsemen and cattle handlers who played a crucial role in shaping American history, and the best amongst them were blacks. Cowboys like Bill Pickett, undoubtedly amongst the most famous, whose stunts were no less than an action swashbuckling movie star, was black. Black cowboys were not just part of the Old West, they helped build it. From the era of slavery through the turn of the 20th century, black men and women worked as cowboys, participating in cattle drives, rodeos, and ranching. In fact, 1 in 4 cowboys during the height of the American frontier era was black. They herded cattle, broke wild horses, fought off bandits, and shaped the very culture the world now calls Western. So why were they erased from the story? Why don't our textbooks and Western movies show the real faces behind the legend? Stick with us as we reveal this true history that they don't want you to know. Another truth that has been buried under centuries of myth, a truth that proves once again that black history is American history. Before we dive in, however, make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay tuned into the channel if you haven't already. Smash the like button and share this video with your friends, family, and everyone out there who needs to hear the truth. Now, without further ado, let us dive straight in. The story of black cowboys is largely an untold one, despite their significant contributions to the American West, with a history stretching back to the earliest days of cattle ranching. While often overlooked, black individuals played a significant role in this iconic American landscape. They worked as cattle drivers, horse breakers, and ranch hands, contributing to the development of the cattle industry and shaping the culture of the West. This had all begun in the 1820s, when enslaved Africans were tasked with herding cattle, laying the foundation for the term cowboy. As the years wore on, these cowboys became an integral part of the ranching industry, with estimates suggesting that 1 in 4 cowboys were black by the early 1900s. These men and women were renowned for their exceptional horsemanship and cattle handling skills honed through years of life's hard work and dedication. They worked tirelessly on ranches and cattle drives, braving harsh weather conditions and treacherous terrains. The cowboy lifestyle originated in Texas, US of A. The city had been a cattle country since it was colonized by Spain in the 1500s. But cattle farming did not become the bountiful economic and cultural phenomenon recognized today until the late 1800s, when millions of cattle grazed in Texas. The city, which was then an increasingly significant new slave state, joined the Confederacy in 1861. Although the Civil War hardly reached Texas soil, many white Texans took up arms to fight alongside their brethren in the East. Usually, while Texas ranchers fought in the war, they depended on their slaves to maintain their land and cattle herds. In doing so, these black slaves had developed the skills of cattle tending, which includes breaking horses, pulling calves out of mud, releasing long horns caught in the brush, and so many other cattle rearing skills that rendered them invaluable to the Texas cattle industry in the post-war era. Texas had become part of the United States in 1845, and by 1860, enslaved people accounted for 30% of the state's population. Among them were some of the first black cowboys, who were skilled laborers with experience in breaking horses and herding stock. Many were given the autonomy to work unsupervised, and some even carried guns. Enslaved black cowboys were assigned the task of catching and tending wild cattle in the Gulf Coast brush country. Working with vaqueros who migrated north from Mexico, these herders often drove long trains of steers led by oxen and trailed by baying dogs. Francis Richard Lubbock, the Civil War governor of Texas, relied on his 5 bondsmen to tend the 2,000 cattle on his ranch near Houston, Texas. Lubbock allowed one slave named Willis to acquire cattle and horses to purchase his freedom for himself and his family. James Taylor White, the first Texas cattle baron, used African-American drovers for the thousands of cattle he owned in Liberty County, Texas. As early as 1854, Amanda Wildey depended on African-American slave cowboys to tend to her herd of cattle. But with a combination of a lack of effective containment, barbed wire had not yet been invented, and too few cow hands, the cattle population ran wild. Ranchers returning from the war discovered that their herds were lost, even out of control. They would try rounding up the cattle and rebuilding their herds with slave labor, but eventually the Emancipation Proclamation left them without the free workers on which they were so dependent. Desperate for help rounding up maverick cattle, ranchers were compelled to hire now free, skilled African Americans as paid cowhands. This year was 1865, and the Civil War had just ended. In the month of June, the 19th of the aforementioned year, Union General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston, Texas, to announce General Order No. 3, which states that all slaves in the state were finally free. This day became known as Juneteenth. Following the emancipation, many African Americans left plantations in search of new opportunities. Some headed west, where they found work on ranches and farms, learning the skills of cowboys. These former slaves brought their expertise in horsemanship, roping, and cattle handling, honed during their time on plantations, to the open ranges of the West. And by the 1870s, black cowboys were a common sight in the American West, working alongside white cowboys and Native American tribes. An interview of William Loren Katz, a scholar of African American history and the author of 40 books on the topic, including The Black West, had reported thus.
Right after the Civil War, being a cowboy was one of the few jobs open to men of color who wanted to not serve as elevator operators or delivery boys or other similar occupations.
And working on ranches offered these men chances to earn enough money to buy their own ranch or farm or start up their own businesses. With each passing day, more ranches were established and the beef market flourished vastly. The cowboy's job was essentially to herd cattle and transport them on long journeys where they would be transported by rail to slaughterhouses. These men rode, roped, and handled cattle with a finesse that earned them maximum respect. They worked tirelessly on ranches and cattle drives, riding through treacherous terrain, braving scorching sun, torrential rains, and icy snow. Cowboys often lived a rugged, nomadic lifestyle, often spending months on the range. Their days began before dawn, with a hearty breakfast of beans, bacon, and biscuits. They'd saddle up and ride out to check on cattle, fix fences, and navigate the vast open spaces. Everyday work was difficult and laborious for cowboys. Work days lasted about 15 hours daily, and much of that time was spent on a horse or doing other physical labor. Their homes were often humble makeshift affairs, bunkhouses, line shacks, or even tents. They would share stories, play cards, and enjoy simple pleasures like music and laughter around the campfire. Work was grueling, with long hours and little rest. Cowboys faced dust storms, thunderstorms, and scorching heat. They would drive cattle across rivers, through canyons, and over mountains, always on the lookout for predators, either humans or wild animals, and strays. Compounded with the strenuous job of a cowboy was the burden of being a black skin. Most times, while crossing towns, they're usually faced with the burden of being unable to access certain amenities like sleeping in hotels, eating at certain restaurants, or staying in certain hotels. But within their crews, they sometimes found respect and a level of equality unknown to other African Americans of the era. Black cowboys were known to showcase their skills in rodeos and other performances, although they often had to create their own events due to racial segregation. However that was, the hostile segregation of this dark era could not eclipse the legends of fine black folks like Bill Pickett, Nat Love, and a whole many others who had gained fame from their distinct performances, which was all too good to be true, to say the least. Bill Pickett, one of the black cowboys credited with creating the bulldogging technique of bringing a young steer to the ground in a rodeo, was so unbelievably good that he was featured in a silent film, The Bulldogger, in 1921, and The Crimson Skull in 1922. One of his very exceptional performances used for subduing a stubborn steer involved grabbing its horns, twisting its head up, and biting its tender nose or lower lip. This exhibition never failed to evoke an earth-quaking, deafening cry from his admiring audiences. People did talk all day about pretty much nothing else other than Bill Pickett's insane cattle moves. Time was just not enough to talk about all of it. Pickett, the second of 13 children, had begun his cowboy life right after 5th grade, putting on shows and passing the hat. Throughout his life, he gave exhibitions in the United States, Canada, Mexico, South America, England, and he went on to become the first black cowboy movie star. He performed at rodeos and Wild West shows until about 1916 and worked as a cowhand and rancher thereafter. In 1972, he was inducted into the National Rodeo Hall of Fame, and in 1989 inducted into the Pro Rodeo Hall of Fame and Museum of the American Cowboy. Sadly, because of segregation, during his lifetime he was not permitted to compete with whites on the rodeo circuit. Sometimes he would claim to be Indian in order to enter events. Another exceptional black cowboy was the legendary figure Nat Love, who documented his experiences as a cowboy in his autobiography, The Life and Adventures of Nat Love. Here, the cowboy, Nat Love, recounts stories from his life on the frontier so cliché, they read like scenes from a John Wayne film. He describes Dodge City, Kansas, a town smattered with the romanticized institutions of the frontier, a great many saloons, dance halls, and gambling houses, and very little of anything else. He moved massive herds of cattle from one grazing area to another, drank with Billy the Kid, and participated in shootouts with native peoples defending their land on the trails. And when not, as he put it, engaged in fighting Indians, he amused himself with activities like daredevil riding, shooting, roping, and such sports. Born a slave in Tennessee, 1854, Nat Love had an advantage over many men, black and white of his time. From a very early stage, his father taught him how to read and write. After the end of the Civil War, Nat had left Tennessee and headed westward in search of a fortune. When he found a ranching outfit in Texas that employed several black cowboys, he asked the trail boss for a job. The boss agreed, but on a condition that he break the wildest horse in the herd, Good Eye. Another noted black cowboy, Bronco Jim, was also with the outfit. He offered a bit of advice. Love survived the wildest ride of his life and got himself a job. During his journey as a cowboy, he learned to speak Spanish, became a champion roper, and eventually went ahead to publish an autobiography in 1907. Throughout his life, he rode through harsh weather, fought Indians, learned to shoot with dead accuracy, worked with Mexicans, and learned to speak Spanish fluently. When a cattle drive brought him to Deadwood City in Dakota Territory during a 4th of July festival in 1876, he and 5 fellow black cowboys entered a competition for a $200 prize. Earning that prize back then was no easy feat. Each contestant had to rope, throw, tie bridles, and saddle and mount a wild Mustang in the shortest time. Next, the men were to shoot targets at a distance of 100 and 250 yards, using a rifle, then a pistol. Love won the prize money and a nickname given to him by the townspeople, Deadwood Dick. Love was rumored to have driven cattle through 8 states, fought off raids by Native Americans, and ridden alongside such legends as Billy the Kid and Buffalo Bill Cody. Another remarkable character was the black-skinned cowboy, Bose Icard. Icard was a cattle driver for the famous ranching partners, Oliver Loving and Charles Goodnight. He worked the Goodnight-Loving Trail from Texas to Denver, and after Loving's death at the hands of the Comanche Indians, Icard became close friends with Goodnight, remaining in his employ for 4 years. Goodnight once said he trusted Icard farther than any living man. And what about George Glenn? This brilliant black man was born into slavery and raised on the Texas ranch of Robert B. Johnson. Glenn trained as a cowhand and trail cook. He rode the famed Chisholm Trail in 1870, the only black cowboy of prominence in the history of the trail. He was honored as one of a small number of black members of the Old Trail Drivers Association at the 1925 and 1926 annual meetings. Another interesting African-American cowboy is Isom Dart. Isom Dart was not just a skilled cowboy, he was also an outlaw. Similar to Nat Love, he was born a slave. Once he was freed at the end of the Civil War, he drifted between ranches until he ventured to Mexico. In Mexico, he began a career as a horse thief. Throughout his life, Isam Dart held lawful jobs, but oftentimes he made decisions to break the law because his heart was broken or when he lost a good chunk of his money in a crooked poker game. Overall, Isam Dart lived a daring life that ended when he was killed by a livestock detective. This history could just go on and on with names of blacks who were heroic cowboys in those days without end. However, the remarkable performances of not only Bill Pickett, but also of other black cowboys was historically so exceptional that it generated the envy of whites. These blacks had later on began facing hostility from white cowboys who saw them as rivals or inferior. The threat of violence lurked around every corner, and many black cowboys began suffering beatings, whippings, and even lynchings. The exceptional feats and achievements of black cowboys, their horsemanship skills, roping and riding techniques, their physical strength, and so on, got on the nerves of their white contemporaries. There were several instances of ill will directed at blacks for no reason. One good example of such events was in the late 1800s when black cowboys like Nat Love, also known as Deadwood Dick, faced discrimination and envy from his white counterparts. There was also the time in 1885 when Love was competing in a rodeo in Deadwood, South Dakota. Then a group of white cowboys attempted to sabotage his performance by hiding his horse. Regardless, Love managed to find another horse and went on to win the competition. In another instance in 1890, a black cowboy named George Monroe was denied entry to a rodeo in Cheyenne, Wyoming, for no reason other than his race. Monroe had been a skilled cowboy and roper, but was forced to watch from the sidelines as white cowboys competed. Also in Texas, in the early 1900s, a black cowboy named Jesse Stahl was beaten by a group of white men after winning a rodeo competition. Stahl's success had drawn the envy and anger of the white cowboys who saw him as a threat to their dominance. In 1911, a group of black cowboys, including Bill Pickett, were denied membership in the Rodeo Cowboys Association, RCA, a prestigious organization that governed rodeos across the West. This exclusion limited their access to top rodeos and prize money. There is yet more. In the 1920s, Murtis Deitman, a black cowboy, was forced to work as a ranch hand despite his exceptional skills as a roper and rider. Deitman's white employer refused to promote him or pay him equal wages, citing racial prejudices. The list is endless. When barbed wire became widely used later on, it revolutionized the cattle industry by making it easier to contain and manage large herds. However, this innovation led to a significant reduction in the need for cowboys, as fences replaced the need for riders to constantly monitor and move cattle. Many cowboys found themselves laid off or out of work, leading to a difficult transition. Some coped by adapting to new roles, such as becoming ranch hands or fence builders, while others turned to different industries like law enforcement or the military. Others, however, struggled to find new employment and felt a strong sense of loss and disconnection from the cowboy way of life. The decline of the open range and the cowboy culture was a significant blow to their identity and sense of purpose. Some cowboys also turned to rodeos and competitions, showcasing their skills and entertaining crowds, while others wrote about their experiences, leaving behind a rich literary legacy. It was a challenging time for many black cowboys, but their resilience and resourcefulness helped them find new paths and ways to preserve their cultural heritage. The transition had affected more those who had very limited job opportunities and more difficulty in purchasing lands. As at the late 1800s, white-dominated rodeos began to exclude black cowboys, forcing them to create their own rodeo circuits. This led to the formation of the Negro Cowboys Rodeo Association in the early 1900s. Blacks worked collectively, forming tight-knit communities bound together by their shared experiences and struggles. This made them support each other through the hard times. With the collectiveness and cooperative ideas of the association, most had begun entertaining at rodeos and sometimes forming their own shows. The 1920s saw a surge in popularity of rodeos, with black cowboys like Bill Pickett and Nat Love becoming stars of the circuit. Their skills and showmanship helped a lot in breaking down racial barriers, paving the way for future generations of black cowboys. Bill Pickett, one of the biggest figures in cowboy history and the originator of rodeo steer wrestling, also called bulldogging, had established Pickett Brothers Bronco Busters and Rough Riders with 4 brothers, which advertised catching and taming wild cattle a specialty. He would later become one of the most famous early rodeo stars. He dropped out of school to become a ranch hand and gained an international reputation for his unique method of catching stray cows. Modeled after his observations of how ranch dogs caught wandering cattle, Bill Pickett's technique for subduing a stubborn steer involved grabbing its horns, twisting its head up, and biting its tender nose or lower lip. By the early 1900s, he and other performers were bulldogging steers in the manner of a rodeo exhibition. The biting technique, however, soon was replaced by twisting leverage that threw the steer. The event remains a central part of virtually every rodeo venue. It was apparently effective and fun for audiences to watch. Among the first black cowhands in rodeo, Bill Pickett was a featured performer with the Miller Brothers 101 Ranch and Wild West Show for over a quarter century. He died in 1932 of injuries received from a rogue horse. In 1972, 40 years after his death, Pickett became the first black honoree in the National Rodeo Hall of Fame, and rodeo athletes still compete in a version of his event today, and he was just the beginning of a long tradition of African-American rodeo cowboys. Since the 1700s, black enslaved workers had been charged with watching over and driving livestock in the American South. By the early 1800s, black men in Louisiana plantations were being tasked with supervising large herds of cattle. Nowhere were enslaved cattle workers more prevalent than in the Texas Territory, where the livestock industry had been dominant since the Spanish colonization of the area in the late 1600s. While emancipation gave legal freedom to black people throughout the South, real independence evaded most. Being a cowboy offered people genuine self-governance, at least in theory, and many African Americans who left the South after the failures of Reconstruction migrated to cattle country, particularly Kansas. This mass migration was dubbed the Great Exodus, and its migrants were known as exodusters. These black pioneers were drawn west by new land laws, such as the Homestead Act of 1862, which allowed settlers to claim 160 acres, which is approximately 65 hectares, of government surveyed land, as long as they improved it through cultivation. Many exodusters trained as ranch hands and drovers in their new environs. As the range cattle industry expanded out of Texas after the Civil War, black cowboys moved across the West along with it, working in every state and territory in the region, with the largest numbers in Arizona Territory, California, Nevada, and New Mexico Territory. In Arizona Territory, African Americans John Swain and John Batavia worked for former Texas Ranger John Slaughter on his ranch near Tombstone. Thornton Biggs worked in northern Colorado. Print Olive worked in Nebraska, Nat Love in the Dakota Territory, and ex-Texan Henry Harris became foreman on the Elko County ranch of Nevada Gov. John Sparks. Even future President Theodore Roosevelt employed one black cowboy on his Dakota Territory ranch. 4 African-American cowboys in New Mexico Territory were involved in the Lincoln County Range War of 1878 that produced William Bonney. 3 black cowboys, George Washington, George Robinson, and Zebrian Bates, rode with Bonney and his regulators, while African-American John Clark worked for businessman rancher Lawrence Murphy. The American cattle industry grew rapidly from 1860 to 1880. Railroads had not yet proliferated, so cattle had to be driven great distances by workers on horseback in order to be sold and processed in other states. Black cowboys participated in a great number of these drives, in which they discovered fairly egalitarian working conditions for the time. On the trail, black and white drovers often fraternized and sometimes traveled in the same groups. Segregation was generally unimportant on the vast expanses of the open range, though black wranglers were commonly expected to carry out certain menial tasks in mixed groups. Black cowboys did, however, regularly encounter racism when passing through settlements, where they were separated from their white counterparts in some establishments and outright banned from others, including hotels and restaurants. Over the decades, African Americans, although still present, became smaller and smaller percentages of herders and drovers as whites moved into the industry. By 1890, the 473 African American cowboys in Texas comprised only 3% of the total number in the state. Overall, black cowboys were about 2% of the total in the West by that date, as these workers sought better paying employment in other industries. But mostly, as time passed, pop culture erased black cowboys from the Western milieu, creating a misleading image of the Old West as populated by white men on horseback, riding the lonely grasslands. A major library in the U.S. holds varieties of collections that help document a more accurate picture of what cowboy culture and life in the Western U.S. actually looked like in the late 19th and early 20th centuries during the cowboy heyday. They include resource guides, newspaper archives, an American Folklife Resource Project, a 2020 concert of old black cowboy songs, books, magazines, photographs, and posters that document the role African Americans played, particularly in the 1870s, when many newly freed black people headed west. The myth of the cowboy is only one of many myths that have shaped our view of the West in the late 19th century, reads the library's introduction to the American West, 1865 to 1900 resource timeline. The stereotype of the heroic white cowboy is far from true, however. One quick example is the origins of Home on the Range, the unofficial anthem of the West, which is famously muddled, but is not disputed that the first recording was by a black saloon keeper and former cowboy in San Antonio, who performed it for folklorist John Lomax in 1908. In fact, Lomax's influential publication of 1910, Cowboy Songs and Other Frontier Ballads, traced several standards to black cowboys, including Get Along Little Doggies. But as much as film stars such as John Wayne, Roy Rogers, and Gene Autry come to mind when cowboy is mentioned, the first actual cowboys in the Americas were Spanish vaqueros who introduced cattle to Mexico in the 1500s. Early Spanish missionaries played a major role in establishing cattle country in the West and training Native Americans as cattle herders. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 sent white settlers west of the Mississippi, driven by a sense of continentalism, later known as manifest destiny, the belief that white Americans should control a vast section of North America from coast to coast. The War of 1812 and the Mexican-American War in the 1840s were fueled by this belief, with settlers marching further west, warring with Native Americans. In these vast swaths of open terrain, where law enforcement was most often non-existent, cattle were a source of wealth. There was no adequate fencing to pen them in, however. This left the poor cowhands to fend for themselves in open country, keep up with their cattle by horseback, and protect themselves from rustlers and bandits. Thus, the romantic legend of the cowboy was born. A quiet man, capable, tough, honest, respectful of ladies, and possessed of a poetic respect for the land and his horse. In the hugely popular Wild West shows of Buffalo Bill in the late 19th century, the cowboy novels of Zane Grey in the early 20th century, then the Western films and television shows in the mid-century, those cowboys were almost always white. It was only part of the picture, though. No history of cowboy culture would be complete without contextualized narratives about the role that Native Americans, African Americans, and Mexicans played. The term cowboy has interesting origins. Originally, white cowboys were called cowhands, and African Americans were pejoratively referred to as cowboys. African American men being called boy, regardless of their age, stems from slavery and the plantation era in the South. Many Southerners moved to the West, and Westerners would have been familiar with Southern racial etiquette. So, it is no surprise that the racial issues prevalent in the North and South were also impacting the American West. The everyday life of all cowboys on the job was usually rough, regardless of a cowboy's racial or ethnic background. Black cowboys were usually assigned horses with wild behaviors, and they had to train them to be ridden. Typically, African American cowboys had more than one duty. For example, a black cowboy that was a trail cook would be expected to cook, hunt deer and wild turkey, perform on the trail by singing or playing a musical instrument. Some black cowboys also fulfilled a role as a nurse, bodyguard, and money transporter for white cattlemen. Notable post-Civil War black cowboys included Pete Staples, a former Texas slave who joined the first cattle drives to Kansas, Jim Perry, one of the black cowboys on the 3-million-acre XIT ranch in the Texas Panhandle, while Daniel Wallace, who invented the cattle brand that became his middle name, became Texas's most successful black rancher. It is easier to find information on well-known black cowboys because many of them were literate and extraordinary individuals. However, these exceptional individuals do not represent the majority of African-American cowboys who were ordinary and had limited access to social mobility. Ordinary African-American cowboys also lacked protection from wealthy white cattlemen. While the American West was not a racial utopia, black and white cowboys were able to share tents and blankets on the trail. In essence, there were thousands of black cowboys in 19th century America. The majority of them were ordinary cowboys seeking an escape from racial violence, and some of them were exceptional cowboys. No one knows exactly how many cowboys there were, or exactly how that title was defined, but a number of estimates by historians, including Kenneth Porter, estimate that of the 35,000 or so cowboys of the era, about 6,000 to 9,000 were black. They worked as ropers, trail cooks, wranglers, and bronco busters. Some hunted game, sang, played an instrument on the trail, or performed other duties for white cattlemen. In Texas, where enslaved black people had been more than a quarter of the population before the Civil War, as many as 1 in 4 cowhands was black. Most of the blacks were drawn to cowboy life and assimilated well because they were skilled at working cattle in their former home countries of West Africa. But still, it was likely the black cowboys who were assigned to do the more dangerous jobs, breaking wild or young horses, and being first to lead cattle across rapid or deep rivers. Indeed, they played a major role in shaping the great nation. Moreover, even in the movie industry, black cowboys were around, if behind the scenes. James Arthur Walker invented the Hollywood hop, where a rider jumps off to the side of a walking or running horse, lands on the ground, and bounces back into the saddle. Today, younger African Americans have been leading efforts to promote and protect the legacy of early black cowboys in the American West by forming riding groups in many states, organizing parades, or competing in national rodeos. The Black Cowboy Parade is another popular significant annual event held in Oakland, California for the last 74 years. New York Times reporter Walter Thompson Hernandez wrote a book about cowboys in Los Angeles County some years back titled The Compton Cowboys, The New Generation of Cowboys in America's Urban Heartland. Also, the Bill Pickett Invitational Rodeo, which celebrates African-American men and women who are keeping the cowboy tradition alive, has entertained over 5.5 million people since its launch in 1984. Founded in 1984 by the late Lou Vasson, the Bill Pickett Invitational Rodeo is the first black touring rodeo in the nation. Based in Denver, the Bill Pickett Invitational Rodeo, BPIR, is named after the first African-American to be inducted into the National Rodeo Cowboy Hall of Fame. Apart from providing an entertaining experience, for the past 37 years, the association has educated spectators on the contributions of black cowboys and cowgirls in building the West. The BPIR brings an important element of black Western heritage into our present-day experience with family fun, education, excitement, and celebration. So the next time you picture the Wild West, remember it wasn't just white hats and Hollywood legends. It was also black cowboys, riding tall, breaking barriers, and shaping the very fabric of American history. They weren't side characters. They were central figures. If you've learned something new today, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe as we keep uncovering the truths that they've tried so much to bury, because Black history isn't a footnote, it's the foundation. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned for more untold stories ahead.